Thank you for coming out here. As you can see, it is day 46 and we're still on zero, and that's just inexcusable. Many of us wrote last week pleading with Senator Reid to bring a long-term continuing resolution before the full Senate that would fund government operations for the remainder of fiscal year 2011. We hand-delivered the letter the 39th day after the House passed H.R. 1, its version of fiscal year 2011 year-long CR that adhered to the calls of the American people, pleading for reasonable, responsible spending cuts. Unfortunately, another 7 days has passed, and your refusal to pass a bill means our nation has moved one step closer to a government shutdown. Mr. Reid, your lack of action and absence of leadership is irresponsible. It's now been 46 days since the House of Representatives passed a bill that reduces the massive $1.4 trillion deficit for fiscal year 2011 by a modest $61 billion. Where's your bill, Mr. Reid? That's all we're asking for. We need help from the Senate. We're pleased to recognize many of our members joining us again today, but we're especially honored to be joined by Senator Sessions, and I'll recognize him at this time.
Thank you. I think the House has a right to complain about the Senate. The House had to make some tough choices. The Republican House, a product of the last election, understood what the American people were telling us. I do not believe that a 6% reduction in deficit spending, a less than 2% reduction in discretionary spending, and a 2% reduction of the entire federal spending is radical. Alabama's Governor, Dr. Bentley, just announced a 15% proration of discretionary spending in Alabama. Cities and counties and states all over America are making tough decisions, so we've got to do it here. I also would say, with regard to the budget, that the Budget Act requires budgets for next year to be submitted. The President submitted the most irresponsible budget in history, in my view, in light of the drastic financial circumstances we are facing. They are very, very severe, and we've got to change. It does nothing but increase spending, increase taxes, and increase the debt off the current CBO baseline. It makes it worse. The House has submitted the most responsible budget in the history of our country. This is a serious attempt to deal with deep systemic problems, demographic problems. And they've stood up and they've produced something, and I think we'll soon pass it through the House. And we've received nothing from the Senate. We don't even have a hearing date for a markup of a budget in the Senate, and we didn't pass a budget last year. So I just would say that I know the difficulties. I respect my colleagues in the Senate, but I think the House has a right to challenge the Senate to do its part. And I thank you for standing up and saying to the American people that real change is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. As you can see, our base of support is growing. Things are pretty busy in the House, but we found time for members to come out and address this because they're concerned about it and they're responsive to their constituents. With that, I want to introduce the gentleman from Tennessee, Stephen Fincher.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Rick, for leading this charge. We are glad to support him in our efforts of moving the country forward. We don't need to forget why we're here today, why the Senate hasn't acted. The Democrats punted on this last year. They never passed a budget. Now we stand here today on the eve of a government shutdown because Harry Reid won't take care of business in the Senate. There's no excuse. We have offered solution after solution after solution to move the country forward, and he's more concerned about politics. He needs to go down to the White House, talk to President Obama. They need to get a solution, come back to us. In November, a message was sent loud and clear from the American public. We are not happy with what is going on in Washington and the direction that Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and President Obama are sending. So if President Obama will stop taking golfing trips and vacations and focus on America's future, our children and grandchildren, and let's start moving in a direction of fiscal accountability and transparency, we owe this to the American public. We're not sent up here to go along and compromise. We're sent up here to lead, and that's what we're going to do. So Senator Reid, please show us your hand. Maybe he doesn't have the votes to pass anything. We have no choice but to speculate Just show us your hand, give us something to work with, and we'll try to do that. But do not blame this on the Republicans, because we have tried over and over and over again, and Senator Reid, it's your responsibility to take this up. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Last week we sent the letter out with a little more than 30 signatures. The follow-up, which we delivered today, has over 80 signatures, not only freshmen but senior members. I want to recognize one of our freshmen that's joining us again today, the gentleman from Missouri, Billy Long.
Thank you, Rick. And thank you for putting this on every day. And if you notice today, we're not on the steps of the Senate where we like to hold this, but we've been informed that we cannot hold these on the steps of the Senate anymore. So we've been moved to this point. Next week we'll probably be out in the corner and then off the property altogether. So there's 2 or 3 things real seriously I want to point out to you. This is not 1995. In 1995 the Department of Defense had been funded. This year it's not been funded. If Harry Reid and President Cellophane decide that they're going to shut down the government strictly for political reasons so they can blame it on the Republicans, the troops will not be paid. Now, we're in 3 wars, at least when I went to bed last night. We might have been in 4 this morning, I'm not sure. But we're fighting 3 wars, and we're not going to pay the troops if the Democrats shut down the government. Here's what we're asking them to do. We're asking them to cut 3.8% off of a deficit of $1.6 trillion. 3.8%, if I would have gone to the home builders in my district 5 years ago when they were doing well, said you all need to take a 3.8% cut next year, they would have said, oh no, we can't ever do that. Today they're no longer home builders, they're out of business, they've lost their homes, they're cleaning carpet, they're installing cable TV. They would have loved that deal. To tell us that 3.8% is draconic, is that what they call it, and extreme, is a little bit ridiculous. Yesterday, President Cellophane, Mr. Cellophane as I call him because he's like Mr. Cellophane in Chicago, he's been invisible. But he couldn't wait to beat it to a microphone to get there before John Boehner did after they had their meeting at the White House to come out and tell us that we need to act like adults. Now, I don't know where you grew up, but where I grew up, the adults in my neighborhood did not spend 42% more than they took in every year. And that's what the government's doing. We're spending 42% more than we took in. The Senate needs to get serious, and Mr. Cellophane needs to come to the table and get serious and quit telling us we need to act like adults. We need a little adult leadership in the White House.
Thank you, Billy. I want to recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Jeff Duncan.
Thanks, Rick. And it's hard to follow a fellow auctioneer like Billy Long, but you know, all across this great land, moms and dads, husbands and wives are sitting at the kitchen table. They're sharpening their pencil, and they're trying to make the ends meet. The House majority has passed a spending plan to fund government through the end of this fiscal year. The Senate has failed to ask. They failed to act responsibly. The last Congress failed to act responsibly by passing a budget, and that's why we're here today continuing to fund spending plans versus having a real budget. And so we ask Senator Reid to act responsibly for the American people, for those moms and dads that are trying to make the ends meet. Keep in mind, folks, the budget, the CR that we passed, the spending plan that we passed, had a meager $61 billion in cuts. We're spending $1.5 trillion more than we're bringing in. This is the 3rd year in a row we've been in excess of spending $1 trillion more than we're bringing in. Households can't operate that way, small businesses can't operate that way, and government shouldn't operate that way. And so it's time to get that job done. Harry Reid, please get to work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. As I said, we've got a growing number of senior members that are joining our effort, and I'm pleased to recognize one at this time from Louisiana, Steve Scalise.
Thank you, Rick, for your leadership on this. The reason we're here today is because last year, Speaker Pelosi, when she was Speaker, refused to pass a budget. Families all around this country have been sitting around the kitchen table for the last few years during these tough economic times, making their tough decisions to keep paying their bills and living within their means. It seems only here in Washington do some of the people that are running the Senate and the President and the White House continue to ignore the real problems our country's facing. If you look at the fiscal crisis, the mountains of debt that are being poured onto the backs of our children and grandchildren, we cannot keep this pace up. We have got to get control over federal spending, and that's what we've proposed. House Republicans started from day one. The first bill we passed was to cut our own budget. We said we need to reduce spending, and we started at home by cutting our own member of Congress budgets that we have in the House, and then we said let's go and look throughout the federal government and start rolling back some of the massive spending increases that we've seen during the last 2 years. American families know that you've got to live within your means. We can't keep spending money that we don't have, and what we've put on the table for over 45 days now is a plan to keep the government running just at reduced levels. I think most people around the country recognize that when 42 cents of every dollar that's being spent is money that's being borrowed and added to the credit cards of our children and borrowed from countries like China, there's a problem. And we've got to start addressing that problem, and we presented a solution that starts this debate. We started with about $62 billion in cuts, and frankly, when you look at a $1.6 trillion deficit this year, that's just the beginning. And the president likes to give speeches every couple of weeks about needing to be fiscally responsible, and then he criticizes us for cutting the first $62 billion. Well, if the president can't support cutting $62 billion out of a $1.6 trillion deficit, how is he ever going to be able to address the real problems of long-term deficit spending that's literally denying opportunity for our children and grandchildren? We're not going to sit by and let that happen. That's why all of us have been working very hard to continue to push the Senate to act. The Senate has been neglecting their responsibility to take up a budget that funds government at reduced levels. We've put that option on the table for over 45 days now. We're going to continue working hard to make sure that we can get a responsible budget passed for the balance of this year that finally starts addressing the out-of-control spending and says we can't keep spending money that we don't have.
Thank you, Steve.